Good morning, and welcome to Lakeside Chautauqua and to our Day 2 with Dr. Karoline Lewis, who comes to us from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. We're so happy to have you here with us live, and those who are listening in and watching us a live stream. I'm happy to report that yesterday, by over 900 people were either watching or with us live, and that's wonderful. We're happy to have such a great crowd watching us and being part of this experience today. As you know, many things at Lakeside are weather dependent, and so today was going to be our book signing, but we're going to postpone that till tomorrow when we will think we'll have better weather. I remind you that 3 of Dr. Lewis's books are on sale in the fine print across the street, and you can purchase any of those books, any or all, and then tomorrow after Faith for Living, we'll go to the porch of the Lakeside Hotel where you can meet Dr. Lewis informally and have your book signed. This evening is Vespers. Our plan is to have it at 7:30 at the Steel Memorial Bandstand. In case of rain, sadly, it will have to be canceled, and that call will be made about 6 o'clock. Tomorrow evening is our picnic in Perry Park. It's $5 a person. Go online and reserve if you can. If not, just come anyway, and you pay then at the picnic, and we welcome everyone for that time of fellowship together. And finally, if you have prayer concerns, please send an email to programming@lakesideohio.com, and we will include those prayer concerns in our Thursday session. Let us now pray together. Dear God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the refreshing rain that is nourishing the flowers and the green spaces around Lakeside. We give you thanks for your word that nourishes our lives. We thank you for the presence of this one who comes to share with us insights into your word that will enrich our lives and hopefully make us a better people and a better community. We ask that you would be with those who are in times of special need this day. Lay your healing hand upon those who are sick. Be with those who are troubled in body, mind, or spirit, and continue to keep them in your care. All this we ask in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, again, I'd like to introduce Michael Schertz, who will begin our morning with some music.
Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for the springing, fresh from the word. Sweet is the rain's fall, sunlight from heaven, like the first to fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in completeness where his feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning, born of the one light Eden saw play. Praise for the elation, praise every morning, God's recreation of the new day.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning to all of you here in the auditorium. Thank you for joining me here, and those of you listening now and later to this second day of Faith for Living, where we're looking at just one story in the Bible, the woman at the well in John 4. And I titled this time together this week, Disciplines of Discipleship. And what is it about our life, what is it about our living that we might learn from this woman at the well? A rather unusual and unexpected disciple. That's one thing that we talked about yesterday. And so if you weren't here yesterday, we looked at particularly verses 7 through 10 in John 4, and this initial encounter that Jesus has with the woman at the well. And this initial conversation, it's a rather long conversation, in fact, the longest conversation that Jesus has with anyone in Scripture. And so what does it mean that they engage in dialogue, and what happens in that dialogue between these two unexpected dialogue partners? And so if you have your handout in front of you, we begin this morning with a part of the dialogue, particularly verses 11 through 15. That's where I want to start this morning. And where we left off is verse 10. And just to remind you of what verse 10 said, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." And so in this moment, Jesus is offering this woman a gift of this living water. It's the same moment that we see in the dialogue with Nicodemus, where Jesus says to Nicodemus, "Unless you are born again," this new birth, from above, again, anew, to be a child of God, which is a main theme in this gospel, that what Jesus offers in coming to the world as God, the Word made flesh, is this relationship with God like no other. To be a child of God, you will be born a child of God. And so that's what Jesus offers Nicodemus. Unless you are born anew, to be born again, born from above, to be a child of God, be a child of the Father. And in this moment, we're at that same moment now with the woman at the well, where they've had this initial conversation, and Jesus offers her this living water which she needs, right? She's at the well. She's fetching water. This is what she was in charge of doing twice a day, typically in the morning and in the evening. She would go to the well for her village and bring back the water to her village. So there she is at the well doing what she does every single day, fetching this water, and Jesus says to her, "I will offer you living water." That's where we left off. So the question is, how will she respond? Will she respond like Nicodemus? What will happen in that dialogue? And so if we look at verse 11, take a look at verse 11 with me. Look at her response. The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get this living water?" Do you hear right away how this is so similar to Nicodemus's response to Jesus? And if you look at your outline, this is exactly how Nicodemus responded. Nicodemus said to Jesus, "How can anyone be born after having grown old? Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born?" Very literal level, right? Jesus says, "Unless you were born again." He's like, "What? You want me to go into my mother's womb and be born again? How is that going to work?" The woman at the well has that same response. "Excuse me, sir, you don't have a bucket. I don't see that you have a bucket. Where's your bucket? And have you looked down in that well? It's deep. So where do you think you're going to get this living water? And so immediately they're on this same level, this moment of misunderstanding. And we talked about this yesterday a little bit, that why is it that in these conversations between Jesus and these characters, there's this moment of misunderstanding? And that's in part because of what Jesus is offering and who Jesus is. We mentioned yesterday that if Jesus had just shown up at the well and said, "Give me a drink, I'm thirsty. By the way, I'm God in the flesh," that might not have gone so well. It takes a little while to get used to, wait, what? Who are you? What are you offering? We're not supposed to understand right away. And in fact, the whole point of this gospel is not to understand what God has done, simply to experience what God has done and who God is. Because if we think that we can actually understand cognitively in our brains that God, the Word from the very beginning, in the beginning was the Word, that God becomes flesh, that God became a human being and walked among us and talked and was with us. Does anybody get that? Raise your hand. Anybody understand that? I mean, really, to understand what that means, that's not the point. The point is to enter into this relationship with Jesus, with God. That's what we're being offered. And so understanding is not the goal here. It's, are you open to this relationship and what God has to offer through Jesus? So she's right at that literal level. And so then the question becomes, where will she go in this conversation? Will she get farther in the conversation than Nicodemus did? And so I love her next question. Take a look at verse 12. Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well and with his sons and his flocks drank from it? It's kind of like, and who do you think you are that you can get this living water? I mean, do you get where we are? We are at Jacob's well. Jacob's well. Your ancestor, my ancestor. They shared the same ancestry, even though we have the Jews and the Samaritans. They all came from the same place. And so she recognizes that same similar ancestry. She's like, well, who are you exactly? We're at Jacob's well. Our ancestor who his family and his flocks drank from this well. And so, but in that question is not just, who do you think you are, but really, who do you think you are? In that question, she is asking one of the main questions of this gospel, Jesus' identity. Who is Jesus? Will you recognize who Jesus is? This whole gospel is about that. Do you see who Jesus is? Do you recognize who Jesus really is in front of you? And so it goes back to, take a look at your handout, John 1:1. And many of you know this verse probably by heart, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's the last part of that verse. The Word was God. So the question becomes, when you encounter Jesus, when you have this conversation with Jesus, when you meet Jesus, will you recognize who Jesus really is? And it turns out that Jesus is not just a prophet. Jesus is not just the Messiah. Jesus is who? God in the flesh, right in front of you. And so what we get then in that verse is actually her asking one of the key questions of this gospel. Who are you? Who are you? And so in verse 118, take a look at that on your handout. This is another place where we are getting, as the reader, we are learning who Jesus is. And so no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. And that's probably better translated from the Greek. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the one and only, or God, the only begotten, or God, this unique God. In other words, who is Jesus? God in the flesh. And Jesus is making God known. And so that's the question that she asks, is like, who are you? It's the main question of this gospel. And so then Jesus keeps on going in this conversation. She asks a question. There's this back and forth dialogue of who are you? And so then Jesus will then respond and say, and give her a little bit more information about who he is. And that's what we get in verse 13 and 14, which is on your handout. Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give them will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." So he, in that moment, is telling her a little bit more about who he is. Everyone who drinks from this water will be thirsty again. Why? This is a well. What happens to wells? They dry up, and you have to dig a new one. But what Jesus offers her is this living water, which she needs, right? She has to have this living water to survive. She needs this water. And what Jesus offers her is this water, and take a look at verse 14. The water that I will give them, you will never be thirsty, because the water that I will give them will be a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life. Okay, so a spring of water. Imagine the comparison between a well and a spring. Like a spring is just constantly bubbling up. Think like Old Faithful, right? It's just constantly bubbling up. It never goes dry. That's what Jesus is saying. With me, you will never, ever have to draw water again. I will give you this water that will give you eternal life. And what he's offering is absolutely key to recognizing who Jesus is. Take a look at your handout. John 1:16 and John 10:10 and all of the miracles in the Gospel of John are these offerings of abundance. It's not that I will just give you another well. I'm giving you water and water and water and water that will never go dry. Which takes us back to 1:16. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Okay, how much grace is that? A lot of grace, abundant grace. I don't know about you, I would be fine with just grace. Like, just grace is good, but grace upon grace? And what does that actually mean? What does grace upon grace mean? And that's what we want this abundant grace. And then verse 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so what we get then in the rest of the gospel is this ongoing, bubbling up, grace upon grace kinds of moments. And so if you flip over your handout to the other side, take a look at the signs that are narrated in the Gospel of John. And these signs are, most of them are unique to the Gospel of John. And in each sign, it's not just that Jesus can do these amazing things, these miracles, It's just how extraordinarily abundant these miracles are. In the Gospel of John, these miracles are never called miracles, they're called signs. Because if we just think about the miracle itself, oh, Jesus can turn water into wine. Great miracle. Super. Yeah, but what does it mean? What does it mean that Jesus can turn water into wine? Jesus can heal a man born blind. Yeah, but what does that mean? What does that reveal about Jesus? What does that tell us about God? Signs point to something, don't they? Signs point. What does this mean about Jesus? What is Jesus trying to reveal about himself? And so every single sign in this gospel is an abundant sign, like over the top kind of experience. And so the wedding at Cana, all right, yes, Jesus can turn water into wine, but how much wine? Have you ever noticed the details in that story? 6 jars, 20 to 30 gallons each, filled to the brim of the best wine when you least expect it. How do weddings go? You go to a wedding, you serve the good wine on the front end of the wedding that was about a week long. You serve the really top-notch wine, you know, the $17, $18 bottle of Chardonnay, something like that. And then when the guests are less than sober, toward the end of the week is when you bring out the Inglenook jug or the Franzia box or, you know, the Gallo $1.99 special. That's what you do. You don't serve the good wine at the end. But, and I calculated this is like 1,000 bottles of wine. And so it's not just that Jesus can do this, but it's an abundance of wine when you least expect it. That this is what Jesus provides. Or the healing of the man unable to walk in John 5. How long has he been unable to move, unable to walk? 38 years, the story tells us. Well, how long is 38 years besides 38 years? An entire lifetime for a first century Jewish male. An average lifespan of the first century Jewish male would have been 38 to 42 years. He hasn't been able to walk his whole life. Not just a few years, his whole life. And Jesus says, pick up your mat, and he walks. And we keep reading in the story, and it's not just that he can walk, but that Jesus is offering him eternal life and relationship with Jesus. How long has the man been born, or how long has the man been blind? Since birth. Not just a few years, he's never been able to see. And Jesus heals him. Well, what does that mean? Now he can see. Well, yes, he can see. But if you keep on reading, we talked about this yesterday, what happens? The man is thrown out from his community, cast out in 934. Jesus hears that. He finds the man, and he brings him into his fold. The thing is that Jesus doesn't stop talking at the end of chapter 9. He keeps on talking in chapter 10. And in that story, in that passage and in that chapter, Jesus talks about sheep. I have sheep who hear my voice. I'm bringing them in also. So who is the blind man now? Not just someone who was healed, but a sheep of Jesus' own fold. A disciple whom Jesus found, thrown out of his community, but now brought into a new community. Do you see what we're getting at here? That each sign is an over and abundant kind of sign, a grace upon grace sign. And the final sign in the Gospel of John is the raising of Lazarus, unique to John, and it's the last sign that Jesus does. It's the sign, it's the moment in John's Gospel when there is the decision to arrest Jesus. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's the temple incident. That temple incident, we'll talk about that tomorrow, has been moved in John. And it's the fact that Jesus brings Lazarus back to life that there is the decision to arrest him. And so when we get to that story, how dead is Lazarus? Really, really dead. He has been dead 4 days. 4, not 3. The Jews believe that the soul left the body after 3 days. So he's just not like kinda dead, or like maybe we're not sure if he's dead or not. He is dead. And Jesus calls Lazarus by name, and Lazarus walks out of the tomb. Lazarus, come out. And so it's a moment of, again, grace upon grace. What's fascinating in this gospel is that the word grace, after verse 17 in chapter 1, after 1:17, the word grace never appears in the entire Gospel of John. Isn't that curious? Inquiring minds want to know why that is. I mean, grace is a good word, right? Everybody likes grace? Everybody? Grace? Grace? But then again, what does it mean? How do we define it? Can we really define grace? Well, grace is God's love. Grace is God's mercy. Grace is God's forgiveness. Grace is God's steadfast love. Yes, 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 and yes. But at the end of the day, we can't really define what grace is. And John knows that. And in Jesus' presence, we simply experience that grace. So what does grace upon grace feel like? It feels like being able to walk on your own 2 feet when you never have. It's seeing the world for the very first time. Grace upon grace, what does it sound like? It sounds like when you are deader than dead in that tomb, and Jesus will call your name, Jody, come out, and you'll walk right out of that tomb. That's what grace upon grace sounds like. That's what Jesus is offering her in this moment. This is my grace upon grace for you, this living water that will never run dry. This is what she needs. The man at the pool of Siloam needed to be able to walk. The man that's Bethesda, that's chapter 5. In chapter 9, the man at the pool of Siloam needed to be able to see. Lazarus needed to be raised. And she needs this living water to see who Jesus is. So when we then go back to our outline, the question will be, what's her response going to be to this? How is she going to respond to this offer of living water? And so look at verse 15 then, what she says in verse 15. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." All right, already immediately, she is beyond Nicodemus. Because Nicodemus, how does he respond to the conversation with Jesus? How can these things be? End of conversation. Verse 9, there is no more dialogue. Jesus keeps talking. All of a sudden now, with the woman at the well, she has moved ever so slightly in this conversation with Jesus. It's very small, but it's movement. There's an openness there. "Sir, give me this water. Sir, give me this water." Even though, notice that she's still on a literal level. Do you see that? She's like, "Awesome. You mean I don't have to schlep my bucket here twice a day? I'll take it. Give me that water." It's still on that literal level, but it's an openness. It's an openness to hear more of what Jesus offers her. And so it's very slight, but Jesus enters into that openness. Now what can happen in this conversation? So first she's gone with, who is Jesus? A thirsty Jew with no manners. That's her first assessment of Jesus. And now it's like, wait a minute. Jesus has something that I need. I'll take it. And so Jesus then enters into that moment of openness and moves the conversation a little. Will the conversation go even farther? And that takes us to John 4:16 through 19. That on your handout I call the heart of the conversation, because this is really a key moment. So in verse 16, Jesus says to her, because of her openness, Jesus takes this conversation to the next level. And so in 16, Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come back. All right, and the question will be, how does she respond to that? How will she respond to that moment where Jesus is telling her her truth? Knows something about her, knows who she is. This is really important. We actually need to read further in this conversation and then backwards. Because take a look at verse 19. The woman said to him, Sir, I see that you are a prophet. What do prophets do? What do they represent? They know things. They know the truth about God. And prophets, have you noticed in the Old Testament, know stuff about the Israelites? And they tell the truth. And how do the Israelites respond to that truth? Not so well. It's hard to hear the truth about yourself. But that's what prophets were. They were fundamentally truth tellers. They told God's people the truth about themselves. And if you keep going in this direction, this is what's going to happen. And so if we think about that Jesus is this prophet, that's what he is doing in this moment. Go call your husband. He wants her to see who he is. Go call your husband. There's a lot of things that she could have said in that moment. Look at verse 17. Well, what do you mean by husband? What do you mean by husband? Like a real husband or a not real husband? I mean, she could have, all kinds of things that she could have said in that moment. And what does she say? I don't have a husband. You know my truth. You know my situation. I don't have one. And I'm not going to stand up here and say, I don't. Say something different. I don't have a husband. She tells her truth. And in that moment, she tells her deepest, darkest, most painful truth about her life. That she has no husband. Which would have been a social, to say the least, embarrassment in that time, that she has no husband. And in 4:17, the woman said, I have no husband. And then look what Jesus says to her. You are right in saying, I have no husband. And tone here, I put on your handout, tone here is everything. He doesn't blame her. He doesn't shame her. He doesn't go, you're right, you don't have a husband. He simply says, I know. I know you don't have a husband. And in fact, I also know more truths about you. And what I know about you is that you've had 5 husbands. And now the man you're living with is not your husband. Now, this is a moment in this story that we need to take a step back and recognize how misinterpreted this moment is in this gospel and in Scripture. Because you will still hear sermons, you will still hear interpretations of this story that say, wow, 5 husbands. That is one loose woman right there. Immoral, sinful. Isn't it wonderful that Jesus forgives her? That's so nice of Jesus to forgive her for her sin, for having 5 husbands. Okay, anybody who sees forgiveness in this passage, let me know. It's not there. There's nothing to forgive. She has done absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, what Jesus names and what Jesus realizes is her absolute, total pain. And the suffering that she's had, and the shame and the blame, which is probably why she's at the well at noon. Who wants to be around her? Girlfriend, you must have done something really bad to have that kind of bad luck. I'm not going to let that bad luck rub off on me. And so here she is, alone at the well, because no one wants to be around her. No one wants the fact that, wow, yeah, your ancestors must have done sins of the father. They must have done something really bad that you would have had 5 husbands, none of which would have been her fault. That is the historical, situational, contextual correction that we need to make. Because a woman's situation in first century Palestine, notice in verse 18, and this is in your handout. In verse 18, there is no forgiveness of sin here, because in fact, sin in the Gospel of John is not a moral category. It's not what you have done wrong. Sin in the Gospel of John is not being in relationship with Jesus. That is what sin is. And so not to be in relationship with Jesus. So she has no need of forgiveness. Jesus is offering her this relationship. And so why would she have had 5 husbands? Why would she have had 5 husbands? She had absolutely no agency in that reality. A woman could not decide for herself whom to marry, nor could a woman divorce her husband. It was against the law, socially, religiously, politically, everything. A woman had absolutely no agency. We have put that on her in our 21st century reality, not for a woman in first century. Why would she have had 5 husbands? Well, either they died, things happen when you're, right? People die, run over by a camel, that could happen. I mean, who knows, right? They could have died, or they divorced her. And at that time, a man could divorce his wife for whatever he wanted. Burn the toast, well, one too many times, anything he wanted. That's why Jesus gets so upset about divorce in Mark 10. You can't just run around and divorce your wife whenever you want, for anything you want. Because what happens to a woman who's divorced? Where's she supposed to go? You are completely reliant on a man for your livelihood. And so if you're divorced, where do you go? And the primary reason that a man would divorce his wife is what? She was barren. You can't give me an heir to carry on my family name. I have every right to go find a woman who can. So let's just pause for a minute and think about this woman who's had 5 husbands, and your only identity is with a man, is with your husband. She's had 5 husbands that have either died or they've divorced her, and likely divorced her because she was not able to bear a child. Of course, that's the woman's fault, right? Not the guy's. But that's her fault that she couldn't provide the heir, and so I'm going to go find another one. So not only has she been widowed and divorced, but she's likely been divorced because she cannot do the one thing she was put on this earth to do in that time, and that's what? To have children. That's your purpose in life, to give your husband an heir, to give your husband a family, to carry on the family name. So that, I get a little emotional in this moment. That's what Jesus sees. Jesus doesn't see her sin. Jesus doesn't see her immorality. Jesus doesn't see her as a loose woman or, something like that. He sees her utter pain and her loneliness and her abandonment and says to her, remember this takes place at Jacob's well? We talked about this yesterday. The betrothal scene of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, Moses and Zipporah. Here they are at Jacob's well, where all of their ancestors met each other, got married, and had kids. And at that place, he says to her, I'll never leave you. I'll give you the relationship you've never had. I will give you a new identity. I will give you this identity that is part of carrying out God so loved the world. That's what I know about you. I will be your husband. I will bring you into a relationship where you will never be abandoned. And to restore and to bring her into a relationship she has never known that will provide for her, give her what she needs. That's what Jesus knows. And so then in verse 18, we keep on reading, yes, I know you've had 5 husbands. Think about how that tone is, right? He could have said, yep, you've had 5 husbands. Or it's, I know. You've had 5 husbands. And the man you're living with now, I know is not your husband. And that's another moment where typically, often, too often, incorrectly, the interpretation is, well, not only has she had 5 husbands, but she's living with some guy. She's shacking up with somebody. Well, here's the thing, friends. There is no shacking up in the ancient world. Like, you don't get to live with someone for a couple of months and test out how it's going to go. To see if the partner really puts the cap on the toothpaste or not. They say they do, but maybe they don't actually. Or which way do they put the toilet paper on the toilet paper roll? That's key, right, for the future of a relationship. Does it go over or under? This is not a moment to figure out whether or not this relationship is going to work. She's likely, and this is on your handout, she's likely, most commonly, living with a dead husband's brother. Because if your husbands have died or divorced you because you're unable to have children, where do you go? This is why Paul and Jesus are so concerned for the widows. Why in the widow of Nain in Luke 11, Jesus sees the widow of Nain and recognizes it because she's a widow and her only son has died. Where is she going to go? So God's law, in the goodness and graciousness of God's law, Deuteronomy 25, 5-10, obligates, it's a levirate marriage, obligates then the man, the brother of the dead husband. Are you with me? Following me? Okay. The brother of the dead husband is obligated by God's law to bring her into a relationship. It could either be a formal kind of marriage where you could potentially have a child together and then that child was accounted to the dead husband as an ancestor to carry on his name, or it could simply be a relationship that is like marriage, but basically to take care of her. And so now she's living with her dead husband's brother. I don't know about you, but I would last about a day living with, a really nice guy and all, the brother of the husband, but wow, no, longer than that, I wouldn't do very well. So there she is, right? Living with her dead husband's brother. And so this is what Jesus realizes. This is what Jesus knows. This is what Jesus knows about her plight. And imagine the shame and the blame that she would have carried to the well, not only those 2 buckets on her back, but in one bucket is shame and the other bucket is blame. Going to that well, and that's what she's carried. And it's in that moment that when Jesus knows her truth, take a look at verse 19. The woman said to him, "Sir, I see you're a prophet. You know stuff. You know my truth." And in doing that, take a look at your handout, is this moment that gets her to the next level of who could Jesus be. And so in that moment, "Sir, I see you are a prophet." She's not quite there yet. We'll get that tomorrow of who, well, the next realization of who Jesus is. That's a little plug to get you to come back. Who's Jesus tomorrow? But at this moment, again, think of the trajectory, or think of the growth already. Thirsty Jew with no manners. Jesus has this living water that I need. Prophet. Now what? She sees that he could be a prophet. The same thing happens in John 9, where the man who was healed, the man born blind, there's conversation around, what happened to you? Who is this person who healed you? And in 9:17, so they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." And the blind man will get farther in this realization of who Jesus is. And so that whole moment in the conversation is in your handout, not to shame or blame her, not to judge her or to condemn her, but it's to get her to that next movement in the relationship. Will she see at the end of the day who Jesus is? Which really goes back to John 3:19. Remember that there are verses after John 3:16, right, that don't end up on those plaques? But there are verses that come after John 3:16, and John 3:19 goes like this. "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light." In other words, Jesus at the well, revealing who he is at the well to her, is a moment of judgment, not because Jesus judges her, but it's a judgment moment for all of us. Judgment in the Gospel of John, we want to think about judgment. Actually, the root word there in Greek is crisis. Crisis. It's where we get the word crisis. It's a crisis moment. God does not judge. Jesus does not judge. That's verses 17 and 18 of John 3. But it's a crisis moment. Will we see? Will we recognize who Jesus is or not? How did Nicodemus do? He's still in the dark. But she is coming and seeing that Jesus is the light. And where will that take her? And so in summary, because we're coming up to the end of our time and we'll leave time for questions, take a look at the bottom of your page, of your handout. That in this moment of what do we learn about discipleship? What do we learn about our own lives of faith because of this woman at the well, because of this conversation? That maybe it might take moments of vulnerability, moments of openness, moments of truth-telling. I think we do a lot of work of hiding, convince ourselves of that, when in fact it's openness and vulnerability and just being who you are. Jesus sees who you are. Notice that Jesus saw who she was, what she experienced, and what did Jesus say? I love you. That's bringing her into this relationship. So faith, a life of faith, means openness. It means telling the truth. It means honesty. And maybe it needs expressing what you need. That the Christian life is not a competition. The Christian life is not, I have more faith or better faith than you do. this reciprocity and relationship of sometimes expressing need, expressing doubt, expressing wonder, being open. And let's see then what you might learn about God, what you might learn about Jesus, and what you might learn about yourself. All right, so we have time for any questions or comments.
Steve, here you go.
I think it's ironic, you mentioned about the well being this marriage place or gathering or engagement, and Jesus kind of just flips that whole thing as he makes it now this divorced place or struggling place.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent some time in Tanzania on a medical mission trip, and I could tell you the women who had children who came, most of them had their kids with them, but there were smiles, there was a glow in their face, but the ones who didn't have children, they were almost off to themselves. They almost looked like they'd been abused, physically abused. I think probably because they'd been crying so much. So
and I think that's a wonderful example, Steve, of recognizing that, and really how true that still is for us. You know, when we think of the struggles that women have had with infertility, not being able to have a child, and how society still expects that of women, and how much shame women carry about that, and so Jesus enters into that space, and I love that comment about that. That yes, it recognizes it's a place of engagement, right? It was a place of future for the woman at the well, Jacob's well, you know. But also you think about, have you ever read like the Jacob cycle? And you know that all did not quite go well with those relationships, and you know, because before Jacob got Rachel, who did he get? Leah. And so, you know, it's not like everything goes well there. And so there's kind of an acknowledgement of that, that God is in that space of broken relationships, relationships that did not go well, relationships that did not end up where you wanted them to go. And that's an important reality, because what Jesus then offers is a relationship that will never end. A relationship in which you will never be abandoned, and never a broken relationship. And even in Jesus' death, even before Jesus dies, what does Jesus say to his disciples in John 14? In my Father's house there are many rooms, mansions. The better translation is abiding places. I am preparing a place for you. So even when I die, even after my resurrection, not even resurrection is like the end all, it's Jesus' ascension, because that relationship will never be broken. And that's what it really comes to the surface in that setting and in that conversation. I love that. Thanks. I think there was a question here.
I think the one thing that we have all learned to do is to put on a facade.
Yeah.
And I am becoming aware of what the pandemic has done to us, is made us all live in fear because of the unknown.
Yeah.
And that produces a lot of anxiety. And for some of us, it has brought to the front how much we hate to ask for help.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a really important connection of how much of our outside world, right, or how much we put ourselves out there, like on Facebook, everything is wonderful, right? But how something like this, like the pandemic, exposes our true human condition and our fears and our loneliness when you're living by yourself, and that companionship. And so that's, one of the things that I have found really meaningful in the last, 8 weeks or so. I walked through the farewell discourse in John with a number of people through the Easter season, where Jesus says, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not let your hearts be troubled." And reading that from this perspective of hearing, Jesus knows that, that, and even when the disciples tried to protect themselves out of fear in the locked room, what does Jesus do? Shows up. He enters into that space. That's the promise we have, right? That's the promise that no matter where we are and no matter what situation, like this woman at the well, you can be a Pharisee, leader of the Jews, or you can be a woman with no name, with an extraordinary difficult life, and Jesus is going to show up for you. Jesus is going to find you and say, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Yeah, it's a great connection.
Verse 16, Jesus said, "Go and call your husband and come back." Yeah. So you have a great motivation there for Jesus. But what if it's just, in this patriarchal society, we're getting serious now, so you need to bring your husband into the picture? How do we keep from thinking that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So how is it that we don't go to, "You need to bring your husband into the picture"? And where I go with that, because that's, where I go with that is that Jesus should have said that like back when he said, "Give me a drink." Right? He's already crossed those boundaries. He shouldn't even be alone at the well. He should have immediately said, "Before I can get a drink, go get your husband, so we're not alone." So we've already shattered all of that. And so that's the first reason that I don't go there. The second reason is that when we see it in the overall narrative of John's gospel, that we start to see that pattern, right? That's what we see for John 9, right? Of this progression of knowing who Jesus is. And that at the end of the day is the fundamental mission or goal of this gospel, is for us to realize the truth of John 1:14. The Word became flesh. And that's what we'll see tomorrow, is that, wait a minute, who is standing right in front of her? God in the flesh. And so, and Jesus could have said a number of things. He could have said, "Okay, I know what you had for breakfast this morning." That would have been, "I know your truth. I know what you had for breakfast," right? But no, he goes to the one thing that he can offer her abundance that she's never had. And so it's a really interesting moment of where we see in John's gospel of, as soon as you make Jesus fully human, you're reminded that he's also fully divine. And as soon as you want to make Jesus fully divine, you're reminded that he's fully human. And so here we get this moment of, I'm thirsty, but I also know you. And because that's who I am. I'm God. And so it's, does that make sense, Jody? That it's like this moment that in the larger picture of inviting her to see who Jesus is. And that's really that recognition And that openness and willingness to enter into that relationship is what Jesus wants. Thanks.
Caroline, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. I want to, for those that are watching, you're hearing us talk about a handout, and this handout has been posted to our Facebook page and is also uploaded onto the website, and you can get the handout for each day. And those of us that are here in Orchestra Hall, there's extra copies from yesterday, and the one from today are out there if you need one. Let's join us in expressing our appreciation to Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
And have a great day at Lakeside.